The White House did not call it a demand. They called it a partnership opportunity. But inside that carefully worded briefing this morning, delivered by a senior official at a session that was not on any public schedule, was a message so blunt that analysts in the room went quiet before the official even finished speaking. The United States wants Canada's lithium, cobalt, nickel, graphite, and rare earth elements. It wants them now. And it wants them cheap. What he did not say, but what every analyst in the room understood immediately, is what favorable terms actually means. It means cheap. It means below market value. It means Canada hands over the one strategic asset it has spent the last decade carefully positioning, the mineral wealth beneath the Ring of Fire in northern Ontario, beneath the Shield, beneath the undeveloped corridors of Quebec, and hands it over at a discount. In exchange for what, exactly, was left deliberately vague. Mark Carney appeared at a podium in Ottawa 50 minutes later. He brought no notes. He did not raise his voice. And what he said in the next 8 minutes has sent Washington into a level of strategic confusion it did not anticipate and is not equipped to handle. This was not a routine trade dispute. This was an attempt to extract, at a discount, the very resources that will determine who controls the next century of technology, defense, and energy. Here is what the White House was actually asking for, and why it reveals more about American weakness than American strength. Trump's Section 232 investigation, concluded in January 2026, found that America's reliance on foreign critical minerals poses a direct threat to national security. The finding was not wrong. For 12 critical minerals, the United States relies entirely on imports. For 29 additional minerals, it imports more than half of what it needs. China controls between 60 and 90% of global refining capacity for lithium, cobalt, rare earths, and graphite. Every electric vehicle battery, every military guidance system, every AI data center built in America depends on a supply chain that runs through Beijing. Canada has 34 minerals it designates as critical. It is a top global supplier of nickel, cobalt, and lithium. It holds reserves of all 12 minerals NATO identifies as essential for defense manufacturing. The Ring of Fire in northern Ontario contains some of the world's richest deposits of nickel and cobalt. Defense experts at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies in Washington have called Canadian critical minerals one of the aces in Canada's hand. And the White House concluded that Canada, because it is a neighbor and an ally, should provide access on Washington's terms rather than market terms. That is not partnership. That is the logic of a patron demanding tribute from a client state. Carney read it for exactly what it was. This is where the story gets serious. Because the White House made this demand at precisely the moment when Canada had finished building the infrastructure to say no for 12 months, while tariff threats multiplied, Carney and his team were not simply reacting. They were constructing alternatives. The Japan Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, signed in Tokyo just days ago, puts critical minerals at the center of a new bilateral relationship. Japan imports 87% of its energy. It needs what Canada has. Japan is not a backup plan. It is a finished deal. The European Union designated 60 strategic projects targeting lithium, graphite, cobalt, nickel, and rare earths, with Canada explicitly listed as a partner country. The frameworks are signed. India, South Korea, Australia. Carney's 9-day Indo-Pacific tour was not diplomatic tourism. Every stop was a negotiation. Every agreement signed was an alternative buyer for the minerals Washington now wants at a discount. When Carney stood at that podium in Ottawa, he was not improvising. He was executing a strategy built over 12 months specifically for this moment. He opened with a sentence that stopped the room. It's a potential opportunity for the United States, but it is not an assured opportunity for the United States. 8 words that rewrote the entire negotiating framework. For decades, Washington assumed that Canada's economic integration with the United States was so deep, so structural, that Ottawa had no real alternative but to accommodate American demands. 75% of Canadian exports go south. Canada, the assumption went, cannot survive a serious rupture with its largest partner. Carney is not arguing with that assumption. He is building the infrastructure to make it obsolete. The new Federal Ontario Agreement, one project, one review, one decision, compresses the timeline for Ring of Fire development from decades to years. Canada has also invoked the Defence Production Act to establish a critical minerals stockpile, designating 6 key minerals as strategic priorities and setting minimum domestic prices. This establishes that Canada, not Washington, will set the terms under which its minerals enter global markets. The message to the White House is direct: Canada will develop these minerals. Canada will process these minerals. Canada will decide who buys them, at what price, and under what conditions. That is leverage. Real leverage. The kind that does not disappear when a tariff threat lands. Now here is why Washington's demand revealed its own weakness. The demand for discounts is a confession that the industrial base Washington is trying to rebuild is not yet capable of standing on its own. Trump's February 2026 Critical Minerals Summit, attended by 54 nations, produced bilateral action plans with Mexico, the EU, and Japan. Notably, no parallel agreement was signed with Canada. Canada was making its own deals with its own partners while Washington held summits about supply chain security. Washington organized a global coalition to reduce dependence on Chinese minerals. But Canada was not invited to sign the central agreements, because Canada refused to accept terms that subordinated its resource wealth to American industrial policy. And then Washington came back and asked for cheap access anyway. J.D. Vance proposed a critical minerals trade bloc framed as a united front against China. Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister said any such framework must be part of broader CUSMA negotiations, not a standalone extraction deal. Critical minerals are one of the aces in Canada's hand, said Christopher Hernandez-Roy of CSIS, and the government has rightly not given away an agreement on critical minerals ahead of CUSMA renegotiation. Canada did not give them away. Now Washington is realizing what that means. Carney's counter was not a tariff response. It was something far more structural. He announced the acceleration of value-added processing infrastructure across Canada. Raw minerals would no longer be the primary export. The goal, backed by billions in federal funding, is to process lithium into battery-grade material in Canada. To refine cobalt in Canada. To manufacture rare earth components in Canada. Not to ship raw ore south and watch the value-added work happen in American or Chinese facilities. This matters enormously. China's dominance is not primarily in mining. It is in the refining steps where raw materials become industrial inputs. If Canada builds that capacity domestically, it is not just supplying minerals. It is competing for the position China currently holds. That is an entirely different negotiation. And it is one Washington did not see coming. None of this was assembled in response to today's briefing. It was assembled in anticipation of it. American EV manufacturers, Ford, GM, Stellantis, have spent 2 years building supply chains that depend on Canadian nickel and cobalt. A disruption halts production lines waiting for inputs that cannot be sourced elsewhere on short notice. If Canada redirects its minerals to Japan, Europe, and South Korea at market prices, the American industrial rebuilding project needs to find a new source. The only alternative at scale is China. The country Washington organized 54 nations to counter. Republican senators from manufacturing states have raised concerns privately. Wall Street analysts have revised their models for American EV competitiveness. These are not Canadian voices. These are American institutions telling their own government this approach is incoherent. Trump has three paths. None deliver what the White House intended. Maintain pressure, Canada accelerates its pivot. More Canadian mineral output gets locked into non-American contracts. By the time Washington softens, the supply may genuinely not be available. Back down and accept market rate terms, Trump gets access, but at prices his industrial policy was designed to avoid, through a framework that acknowledges Canadian sovereignty. Impose tariffs on Canadian minerals, the most self-defeating option. It raises costs for American manufacturers, accelerates Canadian diversification, and signals to every ally watching that Washington will weaponize economic relationships when partners refuse to comply. Every option hurts the American industrial project more than it hurts Canada. 2 hours ago, the White House thought it was applying leverage to a dependent neighbor. That formula has worked before, against smaller economies, against isolated nations, against partners with nowhere else to go. The assumption was that Canada fit that profile. It does not. Not even close. And Washington is only now beginning to understand that. The Japan partnership is signed. The European frameworks are active. The processing infrastructure is funded. The legal architecture under CUSMA is in place. Carney did not argue with Washington's assumptions about Canadian dependence. He spent 12 months making those assumptions obsolete. Washington wanted a discount. It got a negotiation on Canadian terms. Washington wanted a dependent supplier. It got a country building the capacity to supply anyone. Washington wanted the minerals. It still can have them, at market price, inside a comprehensive framework, under conditions that treat Canada as a partner rather than a province. That offer is on the table. Whether Washington is capable of accepting it is now the only question that matters. 2 hours ago, the White House thought it was delivering terms. 2 hours later, Canada answered with a strategy. The minerals are real. The competition with China is real. The stakes are real. But the leverage Washington thought it had over Canada turned out to belong to Canada all along. And right now, Washington does not have a clear move. Not a single one.